Hello, this is Christian Idealism, and today I have a very special guest on. We have Matthew, who recently became a theist. So we got a new person in the club, in the theist club, especially in the philosophy religion community. Now, we've converted. He's switched sides. He's on the dark side now. Welcome to the
Right.
dark side, Matthew.
Well, I think it's sort of the light side, It's the
Oh
side.
yeah, I guess that's
It's on
true.
the side of a being of perfect goodness.
Yeah.
Like that seems like the light side, But yeah, I mean, good to be on the team.
Yeah, so I'm curious. I guess my first question to you is like, I know you went on Cameron's channel going over like why you became agnostic, because you're an atheist. And then you went on talking with Gavin Wortland. I'm curious though, I don't know, maybe you could just discuss like what was sort of the process of how you start off as an atheist and then you gradually switch to agnosticism. And then it seemed like very quickly, like over the span like a few months, you just went full-blown theism, which is a pretty, that's pretty rare. Like there are people that become agnostics and just kind of stay there as a default, but you seem to like go all the way to theism. So you didn't like spend too much time in the agnostic camp. I'm curious, why was that? Like, is it just because the arguments are that good? Like,
Well, so I mean, I think the biggest jump was when I went from both in proportional terms and in the way I thought about it terms was the jump from basically having credence of very near zero in theism to thinking, okay, probably not true, but there are all these arguments for it, maybe like 10% odds. And that was, I don't think, I mean, so, maybe that was the working of the Holy Spirit, depending on one's view. And so, I mean, what happened was I was reading Andrew Hronich's book, and he argues for Christian universalism. And just as I was reading my way through it, I just found myself thinking, this actually seems like the thing that a perfect being might do. This is the vision of ultimate reality that I think might be compatible with a perfect being. Okay, yes, there are still puzzles about the problem of evil, but theism stopped seeming like this just utterly absurd proposition. It started to seem at least somewhat reasonable, like a live intellectual option on the table. So I think that was sort of the big jump, where before that, it just seemed like, okay, there are these arguments for theism, like, you can counter arguments for a lot of things, but really theism is this very bad picture of the world. And it started to seem like, okay, theism actually is this live option. And then after that, it was just thinking through the arguments more, thinking through which made better sense of reality, theism or atheism. And as I sort of considered the arguments more, thought more about solutions to the problem of evil, kind of thought about things in a more clear and rigorous way, my credence in theism just went up and up. And so, if we extrapolate the trend, pretty soon my credence in atheism will be zero. No, that's right. Definitely.
Yeah. Okay. So you said that the biggest jump was from reading, and I have this book, by the way, as well. So it's a really good book, by the way. You guys should
I read it as a PDF. So it's like,
if
I'd read a physical copy, I would have been a theist instantly.
Yeah. So really, it sounds like it was the problem of hell that, like, when you're convinced that that's not really an issue.
Oh no, it was no. Sorry, maybe I described the story. It wasn't the problem of hell. It was more just like it wasn't a religious experience, but it was just something dawned on me when I was reading the book, where I was like, when I think of this view of what reality looks like, where we spend some time going through these sufferings on earth, and then we have this infinitely long, infinitely good afterlife where every knee bows and every tongue confesses. Everyone spends an eternity experiencing infinite joy, having a perfectly intense, loving relationship with other creatures and with a perfect creator. It began to seem a little bit more plausible that there would be some picture of ultimate reality on which that was the case. So it wasn't so much that there was this like some argument in the book that convinced me. And the book's not an argument for theism. It was just like just something about reading it where it just started to seem like, yeah, okay, maybe this is what the world, the God described in Hronich's book, like this seems like what a perfect God might be, consistent with the world. Okay, there's still some intellectual puzzles, but it's at least not completely inconceivable that there's a God. And then I
It's
think the
not
rest of
a
it,
probability. As like I like to say, it's not a probability zero, right? It's like it could be. I guess it's a live option. It's a live contender. Is
yeah, and
basically
I
what
didn't
you're
previously
saying.
think it was literally probability zero. Like I'm sort of a I thought I'm a Bayesian. Some smart people believe it, but I thought maybe like 1 in 10,000 or something, some like really low odds. But and I do and so the rest of it was just being convinced by the arguments, where I just think they're pretty good arguments for theism, and there are a lot of them where it's like it's not just one argument where okay if it was just one then you can sort of shuffle it away as something you don't know the answer to, but maybe I'll think of it later. It's just there are all sorts of different areas that seem to make no sense on an atheistic picture of reality, and I think there are so many of them that it starts to seem like, in a very deep sense, that a view of ultimate reality absent God just doesn't make sense. Similar to how, if you're a young Earth creationist, your worldview doesn't make any sense. You have no explanations of many of the important facts of the world. Like you can invoke, 1 or 2 arbitrary ad hoc explanations to explain individual things, but just your worldview does not it doesn't cohere together. You have poor explanations of things as a whole. And I think the same thing is true here.
Okay, so I want to now highlight that point because, at least my own research has been to argue for theism, not in the sense of like, oh, here's this piece of evidence, here's this piece of evidence, but rather I like to argue for theism in terms of a narrative. And so basically it's like, okay, we can talk about theism and the data, but we can also, I think, separating those a little bit, I think what's actually most important is what goes in between those, and that is what one might consider to be a best kind of world, or I call it an S world, or whatever language you're going to use, just call it a best kind of world, right? Best kind of narrative. And how I like to argue for theism is basically this notion where you mediate all the evidence for theism in terms of the narrative, right? So all the pieces of data, like fine-tuning consciousness, like those all probabilistically support us being in the best kind of world. And then taking that best kind of world narrative, this whole narrative approach, would support theism. Now, you brought up the evolution example, which I thought was very helpful, because I actually think the same thing works for evolution. So let's have evolution, then we have let's call it like, I don't know, Darwinian evolution or something, or whatever theory of evolution you want to accept. Then you have what's called an evolutionary world, and then you have the evidence for evolution. Now, as you rightly point out, right, it's like, okay, you have all this data supporting evolution, right? And a younger creationist might come along and try to find a different explanation for this, a different explanation for that, for different data points. But then when you ask the question, okay, what's the probability that we're going to observe ourselves in an evolutionary world conditional on, creationism? Well, it's going to be very low, right? It's going to be near zero. Whereas if we ask, okay, what's the probability that we observe ourselves in an evolutionary world conditional on the theory of evolution, like conditional on just common ancestry, all that stuff, it's going to be very high. That's what we would expect, right? And so what you're saying is like the same thing applies to theism. It's like, okay, yeah, you might have a different explanation for this piece of data. You might have a different explanation for this piece of data, right? Just all independently, as speaking as a naturalist. But then when you ask the question, okay, what's the probability that you would observe all of this, all these different phenomena within a narrative? What's the probability that, in this case, the narrative being the best kind of world, what's the probability that conditional naturalism? Well, it's going to be like super low.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, I think that's partially right. I think, and you and I have talked a little bit about this before. I think you can do it either way, where I think what it makes sense to do is it makes sense to sort of consider the data points one by one, right? Because, if you're just comparing broad worldviews, worldviews have so many different features to them that it can be hard to sort of compare them one by one. So I think it makes sense to, spend a lot of time thinking through the fine-tuning argument, thinking through what the best explanation is of fine-tuning. But if you just see over and over again, there's thing that's well explained by theism, thing that's well explained by theism, thing that's well explained by theism, you should start to notice the pattern and start to see, even if atheism can, in some ad hoc way, make sense of any of these individual things, there's so many of them that the probability of all these things happening in that way is very, very low in atheism. So I do think that sort of seeing the worldview as a whole is helpful. But I also think it's helpful to just look at individual, spend a lot of time thinking through individual data points. And, I think when you're thinking through the individual data points and how much they favor theism or atheism, it doesn't make sense as much to think of them in terms of the worldview more broadly. Because, you could always say, like, here's something you can do. You can say, imagine you're arguing about fine tuning. You can always say, what are when you look at all the terrible things about the world, what are the odds of a world finely tuned like that? But what it makes sense to do is just consider the data points one by one. So first you say, okay, what are the odds that there's a finely tuned world at all? Well, much higher on theism than on atheism. Then you're like, okay, and what are the odds that there would be all this evil? Well, I think much higher on atheism than on theism. So I agree that data point favors atheism. But then I think when you just sort of compare all the data points, then overall favoring theism. I also think that there are like some arguments for theism that, they're not like, totally decisive proofs that make it so that there's no way out. But I do think there are like, a few pieces of data where I just don't think there's anything convincing that an atheist can say about them. I think of those, there are basically three that I think are really like hard to get out of, which are basically the fine-tuning data, the anthropic argument, and the psychophysical harmony argument. You can say something about them, but I don't think anything that you can say is going to be plausible. At least, and some people will have different philosophical previous commitments. If you're a type A physicalist, then maybe you shouldn't be troubled by psychophysical harmony. But yeah.
Yeah. I mean, is it because, so like those three data points, what you're saying is like, those have so much weight favoring theism that like, even taking into account probable evil and all the, let's call them anomalies to theism, because I do think that there are not, like, there's anomalies in evolution. There's every theory is going to have some kind of anomaly, right? So like, even when we take into account all the anomalies of theism, like these data points just so outweigh it that even if the plausibility of some theodicy being true is like 1%, like that would be enough just to like for the total data to like just completely favor theism. Is that basically like how you're thinking of this in terms of the probability spaces? Or
well, so I think it's sort of hard to compare these to the problem of evil, and maybe I'd find the problem of evil like more compelling than any one of these. I don't really know. It is sort of hard to think through where they are so different, such different kinds of arguments.
That is true, because I mean,
what I was saying was that I like there are some data points where if you present a creationist with them, I don't think, like, if you present, the universal genetic code where you can sort of trace it back by DNA similarities to get back this cohesive structure, I don't think there's anything not that a creationist can say about that's not like super implausible or ad hoc. And I think sort of, I guess maybe I shouldn't have, I mean, for sake of physical harmony, it moves me a lot. And I think it should, I think if you have the correct views on certain other things, it should move you a lot. But there are some views that other people adopt for independent reasons that I find super implausible, but that if you have those views, maybe you shouldn't be convinced. But with fine tuning and with the anthropic argument, I do think that there just kind of isn't anything at all convincing to be said against them. And that's a sort of strong claim.
Did you want to discuss that a little bit, or because I have one other question?
Sure.
I guess, yeah. So my question, I mean, we talked a little bit, and we can discuss probable evil. I know last time we spoke privately, and I know your discussion with Gavin Ortland, it was like, basically that was like the main thing holding you back was this probable evil. Now, I agree with you that in terms of the strength of the evidence, I think that the problem of the probable evil data, whatever you want to call it, is actually, I think that's going to have the most weight in terms of it really, like, I think it could really set the scales basically. And the reason why is, I'll briefly mention it. So this guy named Robert Bass, he's a philosopher. He wrote a paper called, I think, The Many Inscrutable Evils. And basically what he tried to argue, I don't agree with his argument, but basically his argument was like, okay, even if I assign a prior of 99.99% to theism, which is like all of natural theology, once I take into account like 1,000 instances of, gratuitous evils or inscrutable evils, then the probabilities go like completely shift to like, I think it's like 95% chance that theism is false. So that's why, I mean, of course, I don't necessarily agree with his argument, and I certainly wouldn't I don't think it's that heavy. So I don't think probable evil has that much weight. But I would say that as a theist, if you can solve the problem of evil, so at least if you can like provide at least somewhat of a plausible response to that data, find a way to explain that data, then I do think that the probability of theism is like near certain, like pretty much close to one as you can get. So I do think like, as a theist, I think if you're going to be a rational theist, I think you have to have some kind of response to probability. It could be a no norms theism. There are certain theists that will say that God has no obligations to his creatures, so the probability doesn't show up. There are other like skeptical theist responses. There are, of course, I'm a theodicist, so I would take a theodicy approach to the problem of evil. So I do think that the problem of evil like needs to have a good response, right? If you want to be like a rational theist. And I'm just curious.
I actually don't think it needs a good response. It just needs a response that's not so terrible as to disqualify.
Okay, yeah. I was going to ask you that. Yeah. So like, what's like your sort of response right now? I know, you just joined the theism camp, but like this is the problem of evil is the biggest objection. So like, I'm just curious what your thoughts are on it.
Yeah, so I have a post, if people are curious about reading about this on my blog, which I think the blog's linked below, where it's called A Theistic Theory of Everything. And so the basic idea is that God wants to put, it's a little bit similar to a theodicy that Van Inwagen has, where the idea is that God wants to put us in a world that's in some way apart from him, where he essentially does not have providence over this world, where he doesn't control the daily goings on, where the world itself and its causal laws and processes is indifferent to our existence. And the idea is that, just like there might be something valuable about having, before you meet your spouse, about sort of like, having not been sort of apart from your spouse, for that might strengthen your eventual relationship with your spouse. There might be something valuable about us spending time in a world apart from God, where we sort of see what the world would be like absent God. And then if we see what the world would be like absent God, then that requires that that God sort of like does not intervene in the world. Now, you might think, okay, well, then doesn't theism just make the same predictions as atheism? Well, the idea is that, so there are two components to it. The first one is that we have to exist in the world, right? So that explains why there's fine tuning, for example. And then the idea is there's one extra ad hoc assumption, which is that God wants us to have basic knowledge of the broad contours of the world, which that doesn't seem that improbable. Like, he would want us to like kind of know what was going on while it was happening, sort of understand the world. And then that can explain basically all the rest of the evidence for theism. So that can explain fine-tuning for discoverability, why God makes the world such that it's discoverable and that many of the parameters in physics fall in a narrow range that's ideal for discoverability, as Robin Collins has argued. It explains why we have this kind of moral knowledge. It explains why we have modal knowledge and mathematical knowledge. It explains why, why, among other things, there's psychophysical harmony, though I think you can, it's like psychophysical harmony is required for us to be any sort of agent in the world doing anything. And so once you have this picture, then I agree that the prior probability of this is not that high, but once you have this extra assumption, it explains and naturally predicts all of the data, where I think after you have this, there's literally not a single data point that favors naturalism over this version of theism. And I don't think it's that improbable, the prior probability in it is not that low, maybe like very conservative, 1 in 100,000. But then if you have 6 data points that each favor theism at a factor of 10-1, that'll be enough to just cancel it out. And I think there's a lot of data that favors theism. not just 6 pieces. It's like, I actually think there are like a huge number of things that favor theism over naturalism. Like the fact that a physical universe exists. Richard Swinburne has a paper about this. The fact that there are laws, the fact that the laws apply to the stuff that exists, the fact that the laws are such as to give rise to something that's interesting, the fact that there are finely tuned constants, laws, and initial conditions, the fact that there are psychophysical laws that give rise to consciousness, the fact that there aren't just psychophysical laws that say such and such arrangements of physical stuff give rise to consciousness, but that there actually are those arrangements of physical stuff. So there aren't just laws that say brains get consciousness, there are also brains. The fact that there's psychophysical harmony, the fact that you exist out of the infinite panoply of possible agents that might exist. The fact that the world hangs together so well, the fact that time exists, for example, you could just imagine a world without time. Time's a sort of weird thing for there to be.
Yeah.
I'm not listing all the evidence. There's of course more. If people want a list of all the evidence, I actually have I have a blog post called like all the evidence for and against theism, where I list what I think are the data points favoring and disfavoring theism. But I think there's enough that it makes there be this like really overwhelmingly powerful case for theism. And so then if there's an even slightly convincing thing that can be said about
probable, because I mean, so I'm just curious.
This is, I think an error that I made for when I was an atheist, where I think it can be easy to think. You just think about the problem of evil, and you just think, it just seems like there can't be a solution to the problem of evil. But if you're going to do but I feel like that methodology where you just think about that thing and you're like, it just can't be that way, that biases your analysis towards favoring the biggest data points rather than where the whole of the data points point. So for example, imagine a person over the course of, 100,000 or 100 million coin flips, like 60% of them come up heads, and you think, okay, maybe it's rigged in some way. There's no individual coin flip that anywhere near balances the low prior probability of the person rigging the coin, especially if you say, hey, they're a really honest guy. But together, all these little data points can add together to this very significant wall of evidence. And so I think it can be easy to just think, it just can't be that there's a explanation of why the world has all this evil. But I think rather than thinking of things in terms of what can be, or, it's just inconceivable that X is the case, you should try to think about things in terms of probability. Okay, how confident am I? Okay, am I, 10,001 confident? Okay, if I'm 10,001 confident, then if I have 5 data points at 10 to 1 odds, that's enough to counterbalance it. 4 data points.
Yeah. Yeah, because probably people mention divine hiddenness and this other stuff, but I think those are very, not to say divine hiddenness is a bad argument, but I think people overestimate. I
don't think divine hiddenness is I find it not that compelling, because I think it would be compelling if it were the only bad thing in the world. But I think I don't understand these people who are very troubled about the divine hiddenness argument, where it's like, okay, if theism has a solution to the problem of evil, then that means that God has a good reason for setting in a world where kids get cancer, where people starve to death, where wildfires burn people alive,
things that are far worse than
earthquakes, suffocate people under buildings. And you're like, no, I can believe that there's pediatric cancer as part of a perfect being's plan. But what I can't believe is that for 70 years, people would be unaware of God's existence. And then, now it's true, it will still be a little bit of evidence for theism, where it's just like, atheism predicts with probability pretty near 1 that people wouldn't believe in God. That there would be some non-resistant non-believers. And theism predicts it with much lower probability. And so I think, that's some evidence. But I actually do think that once you have conditionalize on the problem of evil and just see how much, after we've taken into account the evidential force of evil, how much does hiddenness add to the case against theism? I actually think the answer is going to be not that much. I think that that's roughly going to be counterbalanced by the following data point, which is that on naturalism, even once you take into account much of the other stuff like fine-tuning, you wouldn't expect there to be all these believers, where if all you knew was that, okay, there's evolution and there are beings that evolve on a planet, what odds would you give to them believing in a timeless, spaceless, immaterial, enormously powerful personal creator who created the universe and like loves them? And, I wouldn't think that was likely at all. That's like a very weird thing for there to be. And so I basically think that once you conditionalize on the problem of evil, that roughly cancels out the hiddenness argument.
Right. I mean, I think it's going to depend on the theodicy you use. I mean, the theodicy that I'm working on. I mean, I've already finished with the theodicy. It's already written out. I'm just trying to, edit my book. But what I found is that if you have a good response to problem of evil, then you could probably extend that response to hiddenness and all the other data points against, or at least most of the data points against theism. I don't know about all of them because I don't even think we have all of them necessarily yet. There might be some things that
paradox of omnipotence.
But yeah, like, yeah, and it's like, okay, so like, was that kind of your line of thinking in terms of like, okay, if there's a somewhat plausible response to the problem of evil, then even if it's not like necessarily like the best response one can give, it's like, okay, I have some way to screen off certain amount of data, right? And this screening this off will tip the scales in favor of theism. So was that kind of your thought process? Like, it wasn't like a single moment you're like, oh, like, the probability causes this is more likely than not. It's more like very slowly, you just, as you were cutting through the arguments against theism, or at least seeing how those don't necessarily work, in that, you have all this good data in favor of theism, which your basically thought was like, oh, well, actually the probabilities, like when you look at the total probability space, right, it's like really plausible.
Yeah, I mean, I think the evidence aside from evil pretty significantly favors theism, and there's a lot of it. So if you can, if you think there's even something slightly plausible to be said about evil, then that'll be enough to make theism the more plausible hypothesis. It's like even if even if there was one like really good creationist argument, which there is not, there are zero good creationist arguments. Yeah. But like, even if there was one really good one, then it would still not be rational to be a creationist, because it's like, okay, yeah, there's one data point, but evolution just makes so much better sense of all these things in the world. And similarly, it's like theism just makes so much better sense of all these things in the world that, even if there's, there are some like one big data point favoring theism, if there are just so many alternative data points, that's enough to kind of counterbalance it.
Yeah. Now I'm curious, which atheist philosophers did you sort of read? I'm assuming it was Draper. Did you ever read Graham Oppy or any of those like big?
Yeah, I read Graham Oppy. I read his debate book with Kenny Pierce.
Oh, that one. Yeah, that was pretty crazy.
Yeah.
I'm just curious I'm curious what you thought about like the way that he looks at it, because well, I don't remember when this, I think this was like, it might have been last year. I don't exactly remember when, but I gave this I went on a YouTube channel called, I think it's Monistic Idealism, and I gave like my critique of Oppy's methodology. So it's not like I think Oppy is being 100% consistent in what he's saying, but I just think that he's like starting off with the wrong method. I'm curious what you think, because like he doesn't seem like he's a Bayesian.
Yeah, well, I find the stuff Oppy says kind of weird. Like I mean, Oppy's clearly brilliant,
Yeah, exactly. I like the guy.
But like, I do find a lot of it really weird, where like, his argument, his like master argument against theism is like, well, anything the theists can add to their theory, I can add to my theory as well. But you can, but then that'll make your theory really complicated, because you don't have a single, simple, unified explanation of all the things. Where it's like, okay, you can always just like stalking horse the other guy's data, and I mean that's sort of what I do with the problem of evil. but
Yeah.
but like if theism naturally predicts all these things, and you have to just totally arbitrarily add 50 billion things to your hypothesis to explain the data, then like that doesn't seem good. And also, like I think the one thing I was thinking about, the prior probability of Oppie's view of reality, or the view that he sort of espouses, I think is literally 0, because there are an infinite number of very simple laws. And so there are an infinite number of sets of laws and initial conditions with a higher prior than Oppie's. And so then if there are an infinite number of theories that beat yours in terms of priors, then the prior in your theory is 0. So that means that the prior to Oppie's version of fundamental reality is 0. And generally, you should not believe views that have a prior of 0.
I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but I mean, I studied Oppie for 2 years, and what I found, well, actually, he's sort of changed. Like, if you read his older work, it's like outdated. So he wrote a book called The Best Argument Against God. It's actually, that book is actually outdated compared to his more recent work. But his more recent work is actually like, okay, like I get it. You're being totally consistent with what you're saying. But you're using a method that I don't accept. So like he basically has to kind of assume this hypothetical deductivist understanding of the philosophy of science. That's one thing. Another thing too is to consider that, like, okay, well, why should we axiomatize our worldviews in the way that Oppie wants to talk about? I don't see any plausible reason to think that's the case, right? I mean, Bayesianism just seems the more.
Sorry, when you say axiomatize our worldviews, what do you mean by that?
Okay, yeah. So let me explain. So this is basically how Oppie wants to go about it. So basically, what he wants to say is that you have your derivable beliefs and then your non-derivable beliefs. Now, your non-derivable beliefs are what he calls your axioms, and these are beliefs that cannot be logically derived from other beliefs that you might have. And so basically how he does it is he wants to minimize the amount of axioms that you have while logically entailing all the other beliefs that you have. Okay, and he does this consistently, not just for theism, but like literally anything. And so his notion is like, okay, if you compare naturalism with theism, his naturalism is just going to win every time because it has the least amount of axioms, and it can tell the most data.
It's like one fewer fact.
Yeah, that's so like it's not Bayesian. Like you have to look at it through a term.
Yeah. That seems. Yeah, it does seem like he's not a Bayesian, and like I just think you should you should be a Bayesian. Where like I don't know. I mean, maybe this is like a totally naive objection, but like suppose there are two theories. One theory is like really implausible, and the other one's really plausible, but they say the same number of things. Like one of them says a perfect God exists and creates a perfect world. And the other one says a perfect God exists and creates the worst possible world. Like, okay, maybe that wouldn't be like there would be no like logical contradiction or something. But it's just like the probability of one is way more than like the same total number of commitments, but one of them has like more plausible commitments once you build in the other stuff. But
yeah, that's a really good point because like, yeah, I mean, if you do a Bayesian analysis and you find, okay, one theory is like more plausible than the other, but like this theory like makes more claims, like logically speaking, right? It's like,
yeah.
Well, according to Oppie, we have to go with the one that makes the least amount of claims, which is like very.
It also seems like that would imply some like really weird things.
Yeah,
where, like
it would. That's why, like for me, I like Draper
that...
more. I think Draper is actually better in that.
Yeah, I think Draper is brilliant. I agree with his methodology. Like, I think Draper is the best. In my mind, the most convincing atheistic philosopher, or at least who who writes about atheism. There are lots of atheistic philosophers.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I mean, I've also seen some atheists like in the religion. In the philosophy of religion community, try to mix the two, and you cannot mix Draper and Oppie together. Like it just doesn't work.
It's like mixing a flammable substance and fire.
Yeah, you can't mix them. So, but yeah, I was just curious about that because, like, I mean, I know you're well informed about like what like the actual like academic atheists have had to say on this. subject.
Yeah, I like. I mean,
so
I
yeah.
didn't read this. I haven't read this in a while, but I did read Logic and Theism, and I thought it was pretty good.
Yeah, so I have it right here.
Uh,
Well, here's the thing. So most people, if you actually understand what he's getting at, hold on, let me try to put it. Okay, there we go. So here's the thing. Okay, I think they not overpraise Sobel, but I think they overstate what he's saying. What he's
I
not
mean, I don't know.
doing
I think
is
maybe some people, not to name any names, but some
no,
people.
but like
do.
here's the thing. Okay, and I'll make this quick. But like for me, it's like okay, if you actually read his work, all he's really doing is just showing you, okay, this is the logic of these arguments. Like literally, you can just making sure that these arguments like are logically valid, but also we can translate them into symbolic logic. Like that's the main purpose of the book. The main purpose of the book is not to like try to defeat theism or anything like that, even though he's an atheist, right? Like that's not the point. The point of the book is not to defeat theism. The point of the book is to show the logic.
I don't know. A lot of it is
basic
trying to
arguments.
defeat theism. He like presses the problem of evil, and he like.
Yeah, but even there, it's like okay, well, you're presenting this argument, but then he translates it into, symbolic.
I mean, he does do a lot of translation into symbolic logic, but that's not the only thing he's doing. Like he makes these responses to all these different arguments.
Yeah, I mean, and they're not bad responses either. I don't like, but still, I think people can and do like sort of overstate him a little bit. I don't know. It's just my opinion. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but
yeah, I don't know. I mean, there are certainly. I mean, I've joked about this to the Real Atheology crew that like they like him too much because they're
yeah. I mean, I like it too, but like it's.
But
like,
yeah, no, I don't know. I think he's correctly rated among the philosophy of religion like nerds on the internet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now I'm curious. What else? So one of the arguments
you're just curious in general.
Yeah, I mean, I'm having a conversation, trying to understand where you're getting at. So
I was making a joke because you.
Oh, by the way, Matthew. So
I
didn't want to make it like that, but I remember I think it was last year or the year before where you wanted me to debate you in God's existence.
Oh.
And I turned it down because I was busy at the time with certain things, but glad that you switched sides, so now I don't have to debate you anymore. I guess we could still debate if you want, but it'd be kind of weird.
Let's switch teams.
Yeah, which team? So you came up with this anthropic argument, and I'm curious, like, are you going to get this published somewhere, or what's the plan with that? And what do you think about the responses so far that you've got to it?
Yeah. So, I'm gonna get it published. My friend Amos Wolin and I have been working on a paper on it where we've submitted it to a journal. It got rejected. We're gonna try to submit it to some other places. I think it's a very powerful argument. And I mean, the stuff the area of philosophy I've been working on a lot recently is very relevant to the argument. So there are different theories of anthropics, and the theory of anthropics that the argument relies on is called the self-indication assumption. And the idea is that the self-indication, I just got to revise and resubmit on a paper that presented an argument for the self-indication assumption. And I basically think that if you think the self-indication assumption is right, which I think it is, and in fact, that the self-indication assumption is right, is like the philosophical view I hold most confidently. It just seems like super obvious. And I think there are like all sorts of really powerful arguments for the self-indication assumption. I'll explain what it is in a moment. But I think if you accept the self-indication assumption, basically the argument completely smooth sailing. The argument just, drops a nuke on atheism. Okay, what's the self-indication assumption? The idea is pretty simple. You exist. From that, proponents of the self-indication assumption think that you should think that more people exist in general. So here's an example to see how it works. Imagine that a coin gets flipped, And if the coin comes up heads, one person gets created. And if it comes up tails, 1 billion people get created. Now imagine you get created from this process. Proponents of the self-indication assumption say you should think the odds of tails are 1 billion times the odds of heads, because if there are 1 billion times as many people, it's 1 billion times as likely for that process to create you in particular. So, okay, why would anyone accept this? Well, first of all, I just think there is this kind of basic probabilistic argument, which is more people exist, it's likelier that any particular person would exist. Just like if you pick more numbers out of a hat, it's likelier that any particular number will be picked out of a hat. If you create more, apricots, it's likelier that any particular apricot will be created. Yeah, it just seems like, sort of straightforward probabilistic reasoning. And then I think you can also show that if you deviate from the self-indication assumption, you get these like utterly absurd probabilistic results. Well, so let me just I'll briefly describe one way in which this happens, and then I'll give another thing in support of the self-indication assumption. So imagine you don't accept the self-indication assumption. You don't think more people existing is more likely. So now suppose that, and this is what I argue in the paper that I got the revise and resubmit on. The idea is that, so imagine there are two people. They don't know when they were born. They don't know their birth rank. They don't know if they were the first two people. And they're considering between two hypotheses. Hypothesis one is that, so they know that what happened was God created two people. Then after he created two people, this is sort of God's plan for reality. They don't know if this has already happened, if this will happen. God creates two people, and then they play a poker game. And then if they get 10 royal flushes in the poker game, he won't create any new people. If they get anything else, he'll create a huge number of extra people. He'll create Graham's number extra people. Graham's number is an enormous number. Okay, so the idea is that in such a case, so they think, okay, it's very unlikely that we're the first. It's very unlikely that that God only creates two people, because for him not to create two people, he would have to, they'd have to get 10 royal flushes. But they reason in the following way. They say, if God doesn't create two people, it's extremely unlikely that we'd be the first two people. Well, if God does create two people, then it's guaranteed that we'd be the first two people. And so if we ever find out that we're the first two people, we'll get extremely strong evidence that there won't be any new people created after those two people. And consequently, given the mechanism by which that would happen, we'll get very strong evidence that the first two people will get 10 royal flushes. Then they hear a booming voice from the heavens that says, you are Adam and Eve, the first two people. Now they have extremely strong evidence that the first two people won't have any offspring, which means they have extremely strong evidence that the first two people will get 10, that in the poker game played at the end of the life of the first two people, they'll get 10 royal flushes. But wait, now they know they are the first two people. So now they predict in advance that a poker game will have 10 royal flushes based on the fact that if it doesn't, they'll have a bunch of kids. That does not seem like how it should work. Where if there are two, like, if there's a chancy event, the probability you should assign to that chancy event should depend on if there's a chancy event with an objective probability. So the objective probability is, if you imagine you keep doing the process, what percentage of the time it'll turn out one way versus the other. So for example, the objective probability of a coin coming up heads is 0.5, because if you keep flipping a coin, half of them will come up heads. So it seems like the following principle seems right. If there are two things, if there are, two outcomes, and the only difference between between the outcomes is in what effect they'll have on the future. So no difference in terms of what happened in the past. They only differ in terms of what they predict will happen in the future. Then your credence in them should be equal to their objective probability. So for example, if a coin's going to be flipped, and if it comes up heads, something big will happen in the future. Your credence in the coin coming up heads should be 0.5, because the only difference between it coming up heads and tails is in what'll happen in the future. Well, this requires denying this in an egregious way. And so just sort of like when you think through the logic, it's just like, because upon finding out that you're the first two people, if more people existing isn't likely, then upon finding out you're the first two people, you get very strong evidence that there won't be many people. And so now you can predict in advance that there won't be some chance event that like makes a bunch of people. So like there's a famous case given by Nick Bostrom where he says, so imagine Adam and Eve find out that they're the first two people. Well, now they can have sex without having any risk of pregnancy, because if Eve gets pregnant and has a bunch of offspring, then the probability, so, there are two possibilities. Possibility one is Eve gets pregnant and has a bunch of offspring. Possibility two is she doesn't. But if Eve got pregnant and had a bunch of offspring, it's very unlikely they'd be the first two people. They could be any of the people. And so, they reason it before finding out they're the first two people. They reason that if the first two people have a bunch of offspring, it's super unlikely that we would be the first two people. In contrast, if the first two people don't have a bunch of offspring, then we're guaranteed to be the first two people. So upon finding out that they're the first two people, they get evidence that the first two people won't have any offspring. And so now now because Adam and Eve found out that they were the first two people, now they can know that Eve won't get pregnant. That seems really weird, where they can be confident that she won't get pregnant just from the fact that they didn't know they were the first two people and then they found it out. Now you can get even crazier things where Adam and Eve can be like, okay, we're going to make a bunch of offspring unless a deer drops dead at their feet. And then they can make deer drop dead at their feet on command, because it's more likely that the deer will drop dead at their feet than that Adam and Eve will have a bunch of offspring. So the idea is just that you have this extremely weird result. Now, it might not be obvious how the self-indication assumption avoids this. The way the self-indication assumption avoids this is that because it says more people existing is more likely, it exactly cancels out the update upon finding out you're one of the early people from finding out there are fewer people, right? So upon finding out that you're one of the first two people, if there are a billion people, the odds of that are 1 in 500 million. But the theory that there are a billion people is 500 million times likelier because there are 500 million times as many people. So exactly cancels out, makes the math super nice and elegant. No scary predictions of events in advance where they differ from their objective probability. Everything is perfectly, nice and normal. Okay, that's the first argument for the self-indication assumption. The second argument for the self-indication assumption, and sorry, I know this is taking a while, but I do think
That's fine.
These arguments are really convincing, and they take a while to think through. And these are just the tip of the icebergs. The tip of the iceberg. I have 10 or 12 arguments for it on my blog. So okay, the idea is that the self-indication assumption. So the case I gave earlier, the God's coin toss case, where God flips a coin. If it comes up heads, one person gets created. If it comes up tails, 0 or 10, a billion people get created. And then upon being created, self-indication assumption says you should think tails is 10 billion times as likely. So I submit this case is like. So this case, only the self-indication assumption says that this is right, that this reasoning is right. So then if that reasoning is right, that basically confirms the self-indication assumption. In theory, you could have another view on which that's right, but the self-indication assumption is basically the only view that holds that, like literally the only view in the literature. And it's unclear how the other view would differ from the self-indication assumption. If it said that, where it's just like, self-indication assumption says more people existing is more likely. So if you have a theory where one theory predicts more people than another and they're otherwise equal, then unless you adopt the self-indication assumption, how do you say it's more likely?
Okay, so now so taking that, you said that if you assume this.
Oh, sorry. Sorry. Yeah. So the
argument,
idea is that if the God's coin toss result is correct, then the self-indication assumption is correct. So that's just establishing, okay, if I can prove God's coin toss, then the self-indication assumption is correct. Here's how I think God's coin toss can be shown to be right, or the judgment that tails is a billion times likelier than heads. So I'm going to give 4 cases. So the first case is you exist. Do you agree that the fact that you exist gives you evidence that your parents did not use effective contraception in the sex act that produced you?
Yes, it supports.
Okay, right. So, I agree. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, consider another case. Imagine it was 1970 or something, and a coin was flipped. If the coin came up heads, everyone in the world used effective contraception when they had sex. If the coin came up tails, no one used effective contraception. Just assume there were a billion people. So if they had used effective contraception, it was so effective that it had a 1 in a billion failure rate. And then from this process, you get created. So a billion people will get created if it comes up tails from the people having sex. Like everyone will get pregnant and have a kid if it comes up tails, and only 1 out of a billion people if it comes up heads. Do you agree that in that case, the fact that you got created from that gives you evidence that the coin came up tails?
Well, yeah, so the tail case would be that no effective contraception, right?
Yeah, tails is no effective contraception. Heads is very effective contraception.
Yeah. I mean, if we're talking about support and evidence supports in the minimalist sense, then yeah, obviously that would be the case.
Yeah, right. And it seems like, it's like 1,000,000,000 to 1 evidence, because it's just like the odds that your mom would get pregnant are 1,000,000,000 times higher if it came up tails. Okay, so now consider a third case. Let's imagine rather than um, 1,000,000,000 people who each have sex, it's one person who has sex 1,000,000,000 times. Okay, that's a lot.
Yeah.
There are several jokes I could make that I'll refrain from making.
I don't think anyone could actually do that in a lifetime, but that's, yeah.
Yeah, so they have sex 1,000,000,000 times. And before they have sex 1,000,000,000 times, they flip a coin. If it comes up heads, they use contraception all 1,000,000,000 times. If it comes up tails, they use contraception no times. So that if they come up tails, then the person they're having sex with will get impregnated 1,000,000,000 times. If it comes up heads, they'll get impregnated only once. So upon you being created from this process, do you agree that you get 1,000,000,000 to 1 evidence that the coin came up tails?
I mean, I would have to, because I've already, the other cases, if I accept those other cases.
Right. It seems like this case is like the last case. The only difference is in the last case, the sex acts were across a bunch of different people. In this case, it's just between two people. But surely that doesn't matter to how you should reason.
I mean, of course, I would have to assume that this person even had the ability to do that in a time, but sure.
Yeah, yes. Right. Yeah, we're stipulating that setup as it's described. Okay, and so then the last case is just the God's coin toss case. A coin's flipped, heads, one person gets created, tails, 1,000,000,000 people get created. This case really seems like the last case. The only difference between this case and the last case is just in the process by which how the people get created. But surely that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how the people get created. If heads means one person gets created and tails means 1,000,000,000 people get created, it doesn't matter if they're created through God, through sex, or through God just creating people directly. Surely that's irrelevant in terms of the probabilistic reasoning once you get created. So if this case is like the last case, that in the last case you should think that it's 1,000,000,000 to 1 odds, then in this case,
well, we would have to assume, and for the fourth case, we would have to go with the assumption that it's good, like that God is all good that he would want to create in the first place.
No. In this case, the idea is just the setup is God flips a coin. If it comes up heads, and it's just a random coin, it doesn't have to be God. It can just be any generic creator. If it comes up heads, one person gets created. If it comes up tails, 1,000,000,000 people get created. I claim this case is like the third case, which is like the second, which is like the third.
Okay.
So in this case, you get 1,000,000,000 to 1 odds that the coin came up tails.
Yeah.
And so this means, okay, this case called God's coin toss, the correct credence to having tails is 1,000,000,000 to 1, what the credence in heads. But that's a result only acceptable if you accept the self-indication assumption.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. Okay. So now I've explained the self-indication assumption. So the idea of the self-indication assumption, given that you exist, you should think that more people existing is more likely. Okay. So then, so how do you get from this to theism? Well, so if you should think more people existing is more likely, that like 1,000,000,000 people existing is 1,000,000,000 times as likely as one person existing. The theory that infinite people exist is infinitely likelier than the theory that finite people exist. And not only that, for any infinite of any size, like if you're like, maybe there are like, so some infinites are bigger than others. Whatever the most, so, and each infinite is infinitely bigger than the infinite one before it. So if you have, let's say the number of possible people is like, I'll explain the hierarchies of infinity. So, I mean, there are different ones, but the one I'll talk about is Beth 0 is the smallest infinity, Beth 1 is bigger than Beth 0, and Beth 2 is bigger than Beth 1. So let's imagine that the number of possible people is Beth 2. Well, from the fact that you exist, you get infinitely strong evidence that Beth 2 people exist, given that it's infinitely likelier that you would exist if there are Beth 2 people that exist, just like it's 1,000,000,000 times as likelier that you would exist if 1,000,000,000 people exist than if just one person exists. So from the fact that you exist, you get infinitely strong evidence that Beth 2 people exist. You get infinitely strong evidence that that however many possible people there are, that's the number of people that exist. Same cardinality of infinity.
Yeah.
So you get infinitely strong evidence that whatever the cardinality of infinity is of possible people, there are that many people that exist. And then the claim is theism is by far the best explanation of that. On naturalism, so David Lewis had I think compelling proof that basically the number of possible worlds is at least Beth2, and so the number of possible people across those worlds is at least Beth2. I actually think it's more than that. I think it's unsetly many. So there are infinite sets with various sizes, and
let's just go with Lewis's. We could just go with Lewis's assumption there.
Yeah, right. So so let's say it's Beth2. Okay, here's a fact. There is no naturalistic model of reality that I know of that's ever been proposed that predicts the existence of Beth2 people, other than modal realism or Max Tegmark's view that every mathematical structure gets created. So if you go by Lewis's view, then you think you get infinitely strong evidence that Beth2 people get created, and then the idea is that, and it doesn't have to be Beth2. It's just however many possible people there are that get created. That's the number of people that get created, and then the idea is that on naturalism, it's extremely unlikely that that number of people would get created. I think both David Lewis's modal realism and the Tegmark view, I think both these are extremely implausible views. I think they don't make any sense, and I think both of them undermine induction. So if this is true, the probability that there would be, n people, where n is the number of possible people, if naturalism is true, is very near zero. And it's not what you would expect on naturalism. And there isn't a good way of getting that many people. In contrast...
How are we defining naturalism? Just curious.
Oh, I don't know. But however you...
That's fine. Just curious what your definition was.
It's sort of, it's some view according to which there are sort of physical regularities and, I don't know. I don't have a super precise definition.
Okay, that's fine.
You kind of know it when you see it. And so on naturalism, the probability of n people, where n is the number of possible people existing, is very low. In contrast, on theism, the probability that the number of possible people that there are, the probability that many people would exist, is very high. God is a being of perfect goodness. If he could create every possible person, he would create every possible person, because it's good to create a person and give them a good life. So he'd have no reason to just stop after creating a few billion people. No, he would keep going. So as a result, theism just naturally predicts that maybe every possible person would exist, or if you don't think every possible person would exist because you don't think that you don't think God could create every possible person, maybe he could just keep adding people, that at least the same cardinality of infinity of people that of possible people that there are, that's the number that would exist. So to recap, and I know this is a slightly confusing argument, but I do think it's the type of thing where you can get a handle of. So anthropic reasoning is how you reason about your own existence. There's this extremely convincing theory of anthropics called the self-indication assumption that says from your existence, you should think that there are more people. Well, from that gives you infinitely strong evidence that the number of people that exist is the most that there could be. And then theism is just by far the best explanation of the number of people existing being the most that there could be, because theism naturally predicts that. While on naturalism, the probability of that is extremely low. And in fact, it's ridiculously low. There is not a naturalistic account that doesn't undermine induction that's compatible with it. So I think if you're a naturalist and you're convinced of the self-indication assumption, you basically just have to hold out for some view on which that somehow doesn't undermine induction, but that means that every possible person gets created. And I think that's really implausible. Just the probability that the number of people that would exist would be the most that there could be on naturalism is very near zero. And so I think it's extremely strong evidence for theism.
Yeah, because so you say that modal realism could explain this, which I think it could, right? Because then in that scenario, all possible worlds exist, right? So then you would have all possible persons, or have Tegmark's view, which I'm not really familiar with, but
yeah, Tegmark's view it's kind of weird, and I actually don't know if it works. I'm not sure, because maybe there's only a specific cardinality of infinity number of possible mathematical structures. So then maybe it will depend on what the cardinality is that you think there is of possible people. But yeah, so Tegmark's view is that basically every mathematical structure is instantiated. So it's sort of modal realism, but just for mathematical laws. So modal realism can explain it. The problem is modal realism.
Modal realism, I don't know any
Well,
philosophers
I actually think modal realism, there's a lot to like about the view, but I think it undermines induction completely, which is enough to disqualify the view. Because if you think modal realism is true, then, so modal realism, for those who don't know, it's the idea that every possible world exists. Now, note first of all that even if you think modal realism explains it, like if an argument successfully knocks out of contention every version of atheism other than modal realism, that's a pretty
you're in trouble.
Argument, where it's
you're in big trouble if that happens.
Yeah, but also I think modal realism, it just undermines induction because so on modal realism, and I also think there's another anthropic reason to prefer theism over modal realism, which I'll explain in a sec. But so on modal realism, for every world, so it says every possible world is real, but for every world that have been like ours up until the present, where things continue as normal, you can just imagine things going wrong in an infinite number of ways. Like maybe everything will turn into a unicorn or a duck or a dinosaur. There are an infinite number of things that can happen. So as a result, you get this unfortunate result that modal realism undermines induction, because for the vast majority of worlds that contain maybe actually an undefined number, but so maybe it makes your probability in induction indeterminate, where you would just have no idea if the sun will rise tomorrow. You can't even put a probability on it because it's so because just for every world that's like ours up until this point, just a huge, the overwhelming majority of them have just things, self-destruct 1 second from now. The other reason why I think theism is favored over modal realism on these anthropic grounds is that, so on theism, every possible person would be expected to be created in a sort of stable, orderly universe where they don't, self-destruct after 1 second or something. Well, on modal realism, the vast majority of possible people would be created in these sort of random chaotic universes. Maybe they'd be Boltzmann brains or something. And so on theism, it's overwhelmingly likely that I wouldn't have that I would be this sort of that this observer who exists in world and is able to have all these experiences and so on. Well, in modal realism, you'd expect people to just be these short-lived blobs that blip into existence, and that it's very unlikely that I would be me with all that I in particular, this version of me would survive up until this point and would have my experiences and so on. But there would be some version of me that would do that, but it wouldn't be me. Here's an analogy. Imagine there are two theories that both say every possible person gets created, and then one of them says that just it might be impossible to take percentages of them, but one says then uncountably infinite of them get destroyed or something. Well, then if you don't get destroyed, that favors the first one over the second, because it's more likely that you wouldn't get destroyed. And so this sort of similar thing is true of modal realism. So I don't think modal realism is an adequate alternative. And then it also, it's sort of implausible that every possible
here's what
world exists.
So you've only gotten, I believe you've gotten 1 or 2 responses. I think just one long blog response. Did you want to talk about that, or?
Yeah. So a guy named Truth Teller, called LaDouche, someone who goes by many names, wrote a kind of long response, and it was an interesting response. But I thought it was really I thought it was very long, so it gave the impression that it was saying a lot that might undermine the anthropic argument. But really, I think none of it was at all convincing in terms of undermining the force of the argument. So all of it fell in 3 categories. One of them was trying to give a stalking horse version of naturalism, where he said, okay, naturalism can accommodate this by just saying maybe all possible people get created, or maybe I just happen to get created. The problem is me happening to get created out of the infinite possible people has a prior of 0. So if your stalking horse has a prior of 0, it's not a good stalking horse. And then the other possibility is that that maybe all possible people exist somehow, or there's an infinite multiverse or something. But none of these, I think, are, even if you have an infinite multiverse, that's not enough people, because the number of possible people is more than there would be in an infinite multiverse. So I think none of the stalking horse stuff was convincing. And by the way, I have a much longer blog post objecting to it, so I'm just going through the bullet points.
That's
so
fine, yeah.
There was the stalking horse objection, and then there were like two objections that were not framed as objections to the self-indication assumption, but that really were objections to the self-indication assumption. And so, which have the problem that, first of all, the objections, they were completely wrong. And then they also have the problem that, like, they're just all these really convincing arguments for the self-indication assumption that, like, if they were right, they would mean that the self-indication assumption was wrong. But the self-indication assumption is right, and it's supported by all these arguments. So, we kind of we know they go wrong somewhere. And so there were those, and I think I addressed those convincingly. And then there was like one point that involved nitpicking something I said about set theory, where I think I was right about that, actually kind of demonstrably so. And then most of the rest of the article was just these arguments that, if true, they would disqualify the anthropic argument, but they would also disqualify theism. So, for example, he argued God wouldn't create, and if he did create, he would he wouldn't create, and if he did create, he would not create beings like us, and if he did create beings like us, I forget, there were a bunch of reasons why he wouldn't create beings like us. It's like, okay, maybe that's right, but if that's right, then theism's already out of contention, and so that won't actually affect the relative evidential force of the anthropic argument, where.
Because I know he brought in. I remember I read it myself, and he brought in Mark Walker's anthropic argument against theism. But of course, that's a different argument, right? We're talking about your argument for the,
Yeah, they both have anthropic in the name, but they're different arguments. Whereas, the problem, I mean, if his arguments, if successful, would just disprove theism, then they won't actually affect the evidential force of the anthropic argument, because for theism to be right, they already have to be wrong, and so then they won't affect how much you update in favor of theism. So, so what he says, God wouldn't create beings like us. Okay, maybe. So let's say you think there's a 90% chance of that. Well, okay, so you can take that into account. That decreases the probability of theism by 90%. But then theism's, after you take that into account, the remaining 10% probability that theism has is the probability where God would create beings like us. And then updating on that possibility, which is the only possible version of theism where theism remains a live option, while your door is mysteriously opening. That version of theism is that version of theism naturally predicts then the anthropic argument's a good update from that. Where you might think there's fact A that is so the idea is just that if these objections worked, they would disqualify theism, and so they don't. If there's an argument like that, then it doesn't even have the possibility in principle of undercutting the relative force of the anthropic argument, because the probability that theism's right already builds in that those objections are wrong. And then I also think those objections were completely unconvincing. But so there could be, and you could get the sense reading it that there was a lot of stuff there, but really all the stuff there was either objecting to the self-indication assumption while not addressing any of the arguments I gave for the self-indication assumption, or were these generic objections to theism that boiled down to God wouldn't create beings like us, or one kind of lame, low energy stalking horse objection. And so all of this I think was it wasn't at all convincing of a response. And so I think it is a little, I'm glad Truth Teller wrote the response. I'm glad the argument's getting engagement, but there is something a little bit frustrating where it's like after someone writes a 9,000 word response, and then you write your 9,000 word response. It's like for people who are not reading through this, they can just get the sense like, oh, there's all this, there are all these complicated debates going on where this stuff's all about my pay grade. Maybe I'll look into this one day, but I'm not an expert on anthropics. And I would just encourage you. I think that if you read through the dispute on each of the points, I think that I was pretty clearly right on all of them. Where I think all of the points are either these generic objections to theism or things he's mistaken about, and he didn't address any of the arguments for the self-indication assumption. So I would encourage you to sort of try carefully reading through them, and I think you'll find the anthropic argument is vindicated. you can write a 15,000 word piece giving 10 objections to anything, but
yeah, I mean, well, for me, I mean, I've talked with him before about probable stuff that's not relevant for the anthropic argument, but I think it just comes down to disagreements and axiology. Like that's the main sort of thing. So I don't know. That's my opinion because I read it. I read his response to, and like my thought was, well, actually, these are just like wrong value assumptions that you're bringing to the table. For example, like even if I think that, oh well, the probability that God would create anything is like 1%, that would be enough to outdo anything that naturalism has to say about persons, for example. So unless you want to have your value assumption, like unless you think the value assumption is like 0.0, like Graham's number small or something.
Yeah, right. Even if you think the odds that God would create beings like us is just like 1 in 1,000 or something, where once you have, well, so first of all, if that's true, that's just a generic good objection to theism, but it doesn't undercut the relative force of the anthropic argument. You could make that against.
Yeah. So like, how much does your anthropic? What is the weight of your anthropic argument? I'm just curious.
Oh, I mean, I don't know exactly how to put numbers on these things, and it'll depend on what the background is, and what other stuff you find convincing. But I find it very convincing. Where, but I mean, it's just like, okay, imagine you didn't know, you hadn't thought about the anthropic stuff, and you're just like, okay, if there is a God, what are the odds that he'd create all possible people? Kind of high, like. Assuming he's going to create it all, he's very likely to create all possible people. Like he has no reason to just like stop after like 50. He would create all possible people. And by the way, I think, the argument, I think the argument that God wouldn't create at all is just utterly unconvincing, where it's good to create. So why would God not do it if he's a perfectly good being? Like he can add more good stuff to the world. Why would he not do that? And, one argument that John Buck gave that I think is very convincing is imagine a maximally horrible God. That being would obviously create lots of miserable people to add misery to them. Wow, the door mysteriously closed as if by magic.
Yeah, I don't know. Probably a cat. I don't know.
Oh, it's opening again. And maybe it's the divine presence.
Just stop looking.
Yeah. So,
it's fine.
Yeah.
But
so,
what were you saying?
So, like, if you imagine a maximally evil being, that being would obviously create a lot of people to torture them. And so then there's just a parity argument where his argument, if successful, would prove that a perfectly evil being wouldn't create either. So I don't think that's at all convincing. And so, like, the only argument that I think is a little bit convincing is he has the kind of anthropic argument where he says, why would God create beings like us? We're kind of shit. Why wouldn't he create better beings? But that I think is just basically the problem of evil. It's like, why, not only like it's just a sort of this generalization of the problem of evil, where it's like, not only why are we created in a world where all this bad things happens, but where we're bad in regards to many of our faculties, where we're limited mentally, we're limited in our ability to feel emotions, we're limited in our compassion, we're limited in our causal powers.
Well, it's interesting because like my initial defensive theism blog post that I took it down, by the way, because it's going to be a part of my book, and there's a bunch of updates I had to do. No, just I had to update it. There's a lot of things I had to revise, especially because I wrote part 2, and then that part 2 is way too long. So I decided, okay, you know what? I'm just going to put this into a book. And well, anyways, beyond that, so I do respond to the anthropic argument in that blog post, and basically I argue that it's using the wrong value assumptions, and that's kind of where the force of the argument only works if you bring in these assumptions to the table. And once you change your assumptions, then you're going to be able to predict the data pretty straightforwardly, or at least it's the anthropic argument against theism is just not going to be successful, especially considering like there might be some educative reasons for why God created us with these deficiencies, and like why even assume, for example, like what if we say that human beings are infinitely valuable? Like, why not just go, if we go with that assumption, then pretty obviously humans as
Well,
we
I don't
live
think you should
now.
think that, but
No, but I'm just saying, like, if we brought that to the table, or if we say, okay, there's like relative value that we have now, just like there's like unique value that a child might have. Like, yeah, an adult person like might have better abilities than a child. Does that mean that the adult person is more valuable than the child? No, they have their own, value and their own
yeah, I
unique
mean, my view is that God would
senses.
create every
So,
possible person and then create them all in the form where they're optimal. So like he'd make every possible soul and then put them in the world with the causal capacities that's ideal for them. And so, for a lot of us, it might be ideal for us to like, I don't know, be in a world where we can, where, we like
yeah.
have these limited powers and, where we undergo suffering for a short period of time, in accordance with the hypothesis of indifference theodicy.
Yeah, so I don't know.
So yeah,
That's all I have to say. I mean,
yeah. And by the way, I mean, I don't want to, like, I think, if you don't want to read through the like 9,000 word blog post, I'd recommend just watching the debate I had with Truth Teller on my YouTube channel about this.
it is.
Channel.
I didn't watch it, but I thought that's probably a better way to go anyways, is just have a discussion.
Yeah, that's deliberation under ideal conditions. And I think you could sort of see in real time that the objections did not work. But I think maybe even Truth Teller felt like, he didn't give it his best showing. He was sort of tired and like, but I mean, yeah, I don't know, like, but I think, that's a good way to sort of see how the arguments stack up. What I don't want you to do is say, oh, this is all very complicated, I'm not going to form an opinion. No, I think this is a very important argument, and it's a very interesting argument. And so I would encourage you to try to think through it. And if people have questions about it, feel free to leave a comment on my blog or on the article linked below. Is the anthropic argument? No, my conversion to theism article is linked below. Though, I
was actually about ready to read that.
If you just go on my blog and you Google the anthropic argument for theism, you can find it. You can leave a comment. Yeah. You can shoot me an email if you want. It's an argument I'm very happy to talk about. I think it's a very cool argument. So.
No, I'm curious.
And like it was one of the big things that sort of moved me in the direction of theism, where I think in particular it's helpful for like comparing theism to a lot of these kind of naturalism plus. Well, first of all, I think it's very bad news for naturalism, but like I think it's just like it's this very it's just this like overwhelmingly powerful argument. Where it's this data point that's like very predicted on theism and is extremely, extremely, extremely unlikely on atheism. And then, and then the other point is that I think it can help do well to disqualify various kind of like not fully naturalistic but non-theistic alternatives, the kind of middle theories like axiarchism or natural.
I was going to talk. Yeah, so I was curious.
Where you say like,
I was curious what your thoughts were on that, because when you converted to agnosticism, I thought, okay, this guy's going to become an axiarchist. I didn't think he would become a theist. So I'm just curious, like, how come you didn't go the axiarchist route? Why did you go straight to the theist route?
Yeah, so I think there are different versions of axiarchism. So there's one that we might call like unlimited axiarchism, and one that's limited axiarchism. So unlimited axiarchism is the idea that just the world as it exists just is optimal, where just the best possible sequence of things happened. And to me, that just doesn't seem very parsimonious, where you think things happen because they're good, just like for no further reason. I also think if that were true, you would expect there to be a God that exists. Because God existing.
Well, actually, that is true, because I think, in some sense, if maximal axiarchism is true, then God, like, that's just entails theism, I think.
Yeah.
So.
And I also don't think it has a big advantage over theism, because it's equally vulnerable to the problem of evil. Where like the advantage of axiarchism, I think the advantage of a lot of these naturalistic like alternatives to theism is that they're sort of like theism, but they kind of avoid the kind of maximal nature of theism, and so they're able to explain some of the problem of evil. But on this unlimited axiarchist view, then you're not unable to explain the problem of evil. So I think this view has these problems. And then it also it's very weird for reality to just be maximizing the good, where if you have a mind, it makes perfect sense that it would maximize the good, because the good is what minds want to pursue. Like, by its nature, it's desirable. And so a mind without limits who can understand the nature of the good will understand that it's worth pursuing. But like for axiarchism, it seems to have a very low prior, because it's just a very random specific thing for nature to pursue. It's like, why not paper clips or argon or like fundamental particles of some sort? There are a bunch of things it could be in pursuit of. So I think that is a problem. While theism has this nice account where you say it's a mind that's unlimited, and then because it's an unlimited mind, it has this desire to bring about the good. And then I think if you have a more limited axiarchist hypothesis, where you say that there's not a perfect, it's not unlimited, but there are these laws of nature that sort of like pair in different ways to bring about more good things. I think that, that's an interesting one, but I think it has a lot of problems, which are, first of all, it has the same problem of just having a low prior, because why pursue good rather than other stuff? It also has the problem in terms of priors of having these just like arbitrary limits, where like it says there are these fundamental laws, and then the laws are like influenced by the good, but why those laws as opposed to some other laws? You have this very improbable thing that the laws produce anything interesting and valuable, and then you also have this kind of like gerrymandered and weirdly like non-cohesive view of reality, where you think there are both these like fundamental mathematical regularities and these value properties that are fundamental, where it's like it's this sort of weird like mix of fundamental reality. And then I think it also has this, and then it'll run into the problem of nomological harmony. But then the biggest problem is it doesn't solve the anthropic argument. In order to solve the anthropic argument, you need some force that's powerful enough to create every possible people. And if you just say there's this sort of guiding good that guides the laws of nature, that makes it so that they are more likely to bring about valuable states of affairs, that does not predict the existence of every possible person. That does not predict that the number of people would be the most that there could be. And so I think, and the same problem with the limited God. The limited God also doesn't solve the anthropic argument. So I think with this argument, an advantage it can have over some of these other really strong arguments, like psychophysical harmony or like fine tuning, is that it is not vulnerable to the vast majority of the sort of like natural, of the kind of like alternatives to theism.
Okay, I'm curious, because one of my main objections to axiarchism, the non-theistic versions of it, is that it seems to be like completely inconsistent with the background knowledge. Like, it's just like there's no reason, like we have no knowledge, we have no reason to think that things exist or things come about just because it's good, like just by the bare fact that it's good. Like, we don't have, like, that's kind of a very weird explanation of phenomena. I don't know. That's one of my reasons. I have other reasons to not accept it.
Yeah, it is a kind of weird way for things to be, where I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I think, it's not that improbable.
I was also going to ask, what about...
Kind of weird.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I don't know much more.
I was going to ask, so the type of theism that you accept, I'm assuming, is a perfect being theism.
Yep.
At this point,
perfect being.
Okay. How come you didn't? So I'm curious, why didn't you go with Paul Draper's view? So Draper, I mean, he's agnostic on this, but like he proposes what's called an aesthetic deism. How come you didn't go with that option? Because I feel like that would dissolve the problem of evil.
I don't go with aesthetic deism because I think, first of all, well, so there are kind of different problems. One of them is that I think that, so there, again, we have to talk about two kinds. One of them is limited aesthetic deism, where there's like a limited designer, and where there's an unlimited. The limited one doesn't predict the existence of every possible person. The limited one does not predict that, it has the same sort of arbitrariness problem, where it's like, why would it be limited? Why would it have these limits? And it's not as simple. And then it also has the problem, it runs into, I think, not as pressing of a parallel, it's not as pressing as the problem of evil, but it's something. What runs into the problem of like ugliness and revulsion, of why is there so much ugliness to the natural world? Now, okay, you can go with skeptical theism, the sort of equivalent where you're like, okay, maybe ugly parts add to the beautiful tapestry, but skeptical theist can say a similar thing, and it is just not what you would expect. And then it just like it doesn't predict some of the stuff as well. It doesn't predict that there would be laws or psychophysical harmony, and then it's also like, why would they care about beauty? Like to me, that seems like saying, oh, there's an all-powerful God who cares only about paper clips, or who cares only about like the number of squares in the universe. Like, no, what? That's a really weird thing to care about, where you have to have a limit on his rationality so that he doesn't care about other stuff. So he's like enormously powerful. He can create all possible people, but then he only cares about the beautiful stuff. Well, if you have a perfect being, an unlimited mind, then you get to sort of care about other stuff. So I think all that counts against the view. It also, it is kind of like weirdly arbitrary. There are some other stuff I have to say about it. Let me pull up my response to Joe Schmid.
Because your response to Joe Schmid. When was this
well, he and I we're doing a debate on Cameron's channel, and so
on God's existence.
And this is one of the arguments he raises. So I think in addition to this, it's not a good explanation of evil. So I think like the only good way to explain all the evils in the world is to co-opt the hypothesis of indifference. Now, as I've argued, I think perfect being theism, but I think it can co-opt the hypothesis of indifference with my theodicy. I don't think there's as plausible of a story about how his theodicy, or about how the like aesthetic deism can co-opt it.
Interesting.
I also think, maybe like if there was a being of maximal aesthetic value, that would just be God, because goodness is a kind of beauty.
That is true, yeah.
And so just like an unlimited. And then I'm also skeptical that I don't know if if beauty is fundamental. I'm kind of sympathetic to the view that I maybe like their naturalism about beauty is true, where it's this thing kind of linguistically constructed where we arbitrarily pick out this feature of reality, or maybe it's not even objective at all. But I'm dubious that it's joint carving in the same way that reality, that good and evil are. And then also it's very weird that, well, I don't know why they'd create all possible people. That's like a kind of weird thing to create. And then also, I think beauty is just one kind of value in the world. Like, there are various different kinds of value. So it's weird for them to care about like only one kind of value. Like, I mean, imagine, okay, here's a parallel hypothesis. There's a being that's all powerful, but that like only cares about like pleasure had on Wednesday. Like, what? Why would they only care about that kind of value?
It's true.
Like that's not a good theory. That's weird and arbitrary. And I think aesthetic deism's weird and arbitrary in a similar way. And then,
it's very interesting. Yeah, so go
and
ahead.
then the last point, and this is not a super specific objection, but this is just a sort of more general methodological point. I think it's kind of helpful to, like, we're born with being totally wrong about lots of things. And so one way in which you can see if one kind of indication that you're totally wrong about things is like if there are lots of smart people who believe one thing, and you kind of like, you notice that just as you like think more, you find the evidence, sort of like more piling up in favor of their view. And then you just keep having to say, well, the evidence that we all know about, it's enough to outweigh. And that's kind of how I started to feel about theism, where it's like, the more I think about new areas, the more the evidence just pops up. It's like, okay, like that's kind of weird, like this just seems to support the hypothesis that I'm just totally confused and that the theists are right. Because, like if you notice you keep drifting in one direction, you should sort of you should assume, okay, that's pretty good evidence that you're kind of foundationally confused about things. And so similarly, I think if you notice, like, I think if you find yourself drifting from like full-on atheism to the direction very near theism, then while there were other people who were basically in this direction from day one, who like found all these forecasts of like the evidence very predictable, where they sort of, then you should sort of take them more seriously, where it's like, they've been right about everything. And even though, I'm not sure, there's this other view that's sort of plausible. If like no one believes that view and people don't find it plausible, you should sort of, you should take other people kind of seriously and then think, okay, if the people who have correctly identified a theory that predicts all this evidence, like if I find myself keeping moving in the direction of people's view, eventually, and there are a lot of smart people who believe it, eventually you should think, okay, probably just these people are right and I'm wrong.
Yeah, I mean, that is a good point. I was gonna also point out how I think perfect being I know Draper wants to say that like perfect being theism is more like God caring about the moral domain, but I think that also runs to a similar problem as aesthetic deism does, and that is like, why would God only care about the moral domain? Like, why wouldn't God care about all value? Like, that's my view, basically. I think
the moral domain captures all value. Like,
it does.
All value gives you moral reasons to act.
It does, yeah. But I also think
so. Then he is caring about all value from
that. One important thing to point out is, I think we could say, okay, there's what's called like moral theism. God only cares about moral truths. Then you have aesthetic deism. God only cares about beauty. But then we have like this other theism where God cares actually about all value, not just aesthetic, not just moral, but like all of it, the whole shebang. Like that seems to be that seems to very clearly just explain all the data that it needs to explain in a very straightforward manner. Whereas these alternative views like aesthetic deism, pure moral theism, axiarchism, they seem to fall short of this kind of maximalist, type of theism that I'm describing. I'm just curious because that's generally my line of thinking. I don't know if that's your line of thinking as well, but yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I just think moral reasons cover all that stuff. Where like, because I mean, I don't actually think beauty has intrinsic value, but I guess maybe it does. I don't know, but I kind of lean.
I don't think it has to, but
yeah. But if you think it does, then it would give you moral reasons to bring it about, because you have moral reasons to bring about good stuff.
All right, we are about the hour and 30-minute mark. Is there anything else you wanted to discuss? Because there is one thing I want to say about the stalking horse objection, but I don't know if you wanted to go there.
We could if you want, or we could wrap up. Either one's fine.
Okay. Yeah, so that objection, okay, so basically it's like, well, I guess what it's really trying to say is that naturalism can explain fine-tuning just as well as theism, because naturalism can just say, oh, there's this mysterious property that has this natural disposition, right, towards a fine-tuned universe. And so I predict the data. I know there's this one guy named Destroyer, I think, not Destroyer, Detroyer. He wrote a blog a while back, given like this kind of mathematical demonstration of stalking horse. And I think the main issue with that is like, okay, well, first of all, like, it's not very implausible to think that like that a designer would want to design a universe. Like, it's just until by definition, right? But also, it doesn't really matter what the kind of design that we observe, because if we find design like fine tuning, then, and if we have a hypothesis which contains within the definition, it contains content which is about design, then it seems very straightforward that you're going to like design the evidence for theism over and against non-design. Now that's not the only issue. I think the other problem is that there's a way you can actually, like, remember from earlier where I mentioned how there's actually, like, there needs to be sort of this mediation between the data and in theism. Like, there has to be this intermediate kind of proposition that filters everything. And it's interesting because I was using ChatGPT to, like, try to get the mathematical results. And what I found was if we put in the proposition, like a proposition is fine-tuning, that's the evidence, then we have theism or design hypothesis. If the proposition in the middle is something like a best kind of world or some narrative, then it's no longer whether fine-tuning is direct evidence for theism. That's not what's important. Rather, what's important is whether fine-tuning is evidence that we live in a best kind of world, right? And what are the characteristics of that world? Now, that's a different... The cool thing about this is that's a different probability question. So stalking horse is not going to apply. Stalking horse only could apply if we try to have fine-tuning as direct evidence for theism. But that doesn't need to be the case. You could instead have it be indirect evidence through this intermediate proposition. The reason why I mention this is because I actually think, Matthew, that there is, let's just say, like, there's a new wave of natural theology that's, I think, gonna hit the philosophy religion community within the next few years, and it's going to, like, if I'm going to be honest with you, like, it's going to really, I think, refute a lot of atheological objections to not just to the evidence from fine-tuning, but also a lot of other arguments for theism, right? So I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that, just because, like, this is a really new development, and I don't know what's gonna happen.
Yeah, I think all that's plausible.
Yeah, so I'm also wondering what's kind of your response to the stalking horse objection, if you think.
I mean,
like, what's your thought?
I've always not, like, it always seems like a really weird response where it's like, okay, yeah, you can always you can always just add, like, extra stuff to your theory to explain contrary data, but the question is whether the probability is high that it would explain the contrary data, where, like, for example, you can, like, the young Earth creationists can stalking horse their way through all the evidence for evolution by just building it into their hypothesis. And it's like, it's all really improbable. So, like, why would you think that? Yeah, I don't know. The stalking horse argument just always seems kind of weird.
Sorry, I'm trying to see. Oh, okay. Oh, I guess Amos is in the chat, so I don't know who that was, but anyways. Hello.
Oh wait, no, sorry, that's me.
Oh, that's you. Okay, sorry,
yeah.
My bad.
Yeah, sorry, I got it.
Wait, no, because I looked that up. I'm just like, wait, who is this? And I saw Amos for some reason. I thought that was him, but you're good. Okay, interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's all I have to say.
Yeah. Reflective journey. You were asking. So yeah, some people, just to address it briefly, what some people were saying in the chat. I realized my explanation of some of the stuff supporting the self-indication assumption was kind of tricky, and it is a tricky topic to explain.
Oh, yeah.
If you want to see the two best arguments for it, I would recommend you Google. Joe Carl Smith has good stuff on it, but if you want to see what I think the two best arguments, if you Google alternatives to the self-indication assumption are doomed, then you'll find it. And similarly, if you Google the self-indication assumption works as well as effective contraception, that you'll get the other argument.
Interesting.
Yeah.
By the way, I'm a Catholic, so we're against contraception, but I like you using it as an argument.
Well, it's not about whether it's morally valuable. It's about whether it's effective and.
No, I know. It's just I don't know. I found that funny, but anyways. All right. I don't have anything else to ask. I do have one last question. Okay, one last question, and this is sort of, I think this will be a good closing. So, because you're a theist now, like, are you going to start investigating, like, which religion is true, or are you just not
Yeah.
gonna
I
look
mean, I've
into that?
investigated it quite a bit, and so far I think they're all false.
Okay, that's fine.
But I'm looking more into the maximal data case.
For the resurrection?
Because, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
The minimal facts case, I think it's interesting. I think it's some evidence. Maybe there's enough, but I don't know. I'm not convinced. I'm just not convinced.
No, I don't
You may
don't
be
go
convinced.
don't whatever you do, Matthew, do not don't even waste your time with minimal facts. Like,
No,
don't even
I
go
think
there.
you guys massively undersell the minimal facts. All you internet maximal data people, you all spend your time thumbing up your nose at the minimal facts argument, and it's absurd. The minimal facts argument is a good argument. Now, I don't think it's enough to establish theism, but I think it's like there are all these facts that are kind of widely agreed upon among New Testament scholars, and then
Yeah.
Christianity is a very good explanation of them.
Yeah, if you ever do want to get into that, let me know, or you can reach out to Eric Manning, and you could talk to him about
Yeah,
it.
I've talked with him I think 1 or 2 times. Yeah, and I've watched some of his stuff. I was reading through Lydia McGrew's book. I started writing an article reflecting on all the alleged undefined coincidences, and I got like 8,000 words in. I stopped. But
Oh, geez.
I didn't find a lot of the undesigned coincidences to be that impressive, where I thought they could be explained in some other ways. But that's a topic for another day.
Yeah, it's fine. Yeah, I was just curious if you.
Yeah, I'm also kind of with Amos, where I think maybe Hinduism's right. It got a lot right. It got that we should care about animals. It got that there are plausible arguments for reincarnation and pre-existence. It got the value of meditation. It's sort of very big and old.
Yeah, another thing too with Hinduism is it's not really a single religion. It's more of like different traditions in the same. Yeah, but anyways.
Yeah, you might think of this sort of strain where you say, the scriptures are in some way divine and the kind of common teachings are right. And there's a perfect being. You might think that's right. Yeah, wait, sorry.
Right.
Just very briefly, to address what Reflective Journey is saying in the chat. No part of the argument, the anthropic argument, relies on any view about the metaphysics of time, whether you're an A theorist or a B theorist. It doesn't rely on whether the future is open or closed. Like the alternatives to the self-indication assumption being doomed argument, the idea is it doesn't matter if it's open or closed. The point is you don't know the time at which you're around. So you reason, if there are a bunch of people, given that I don't know when I am, it's very unlikely that I'd be one of the first 2 people, because you assign you doing like you could be any of the people. You could, and so it's very unlikely you'd be the first 2 people. But yeah.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Matthew.
Me on.
Thanks for coming on.
And
this is this is big news. Becoming a theist, damn.
Wow.
Welcome to the light side.
Yeah. Thanks.
All right. Is there? Oh, there's no more comments. Okay. Have a nice night.